unfold.
Okay, let's just dive right in. For most of history, death was, well, it was simple.
Completely. It was an event, a switch.
Yeah. On to off. Heart stops, breath stops, that's it. Story over. Done and dusted.
That was the paradigm for millennia. But then modern medicine, and specifically CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, in the back half of the 20th century, it just completely shattered that idea.
It blew it wide open.
It did. We don't see death as an event anymore. We now understand it as a process, a biological gray zone that can unfold over minutes, maybe even hours, as all the different systems in the body shut down one by one.
And it's right there in that gray zone, that borderland between what we call clinical death and, the point of no return. That's where we find this absolutely profound, just baffling phenomenon.
The recalled experience of death, or ND.
Which most people, myself included, probably still know by its older name, the near-death experience, or NDE.
Exactly. And our mission today, what you're calling the threshold investigation, is to really map that borderland. And we're not going to be using, anecdotal stories from talk shows. We're going to use the hard, verifiable neuroscience that's trying to decode what's happening in those final moments.
So the big question for you, listening at home, is really fundamental. Are these experiences, and they're so structured, the tunnels, the light, the life review, are they just the chaotic, sputtering of a dying brain?
The last gasp of a failing organ.
Or are they something else? Maybe a coherent biological function that actually challenges our most basic ideas about the brain and the mind and how those two things are connected.
And to even start that investigation, we have to get our language right. Because in the clinical world, that old term near-death experience, which Raymond Moody coined back in '75, it's become a bit of a problem.
Right. Why is that? It sounds straightforward. You were near death, you came back.
Well, from a resuscitation science perspective, it's not quite accurate. When a patient goes into cardiac arrest, their heart has stopped. They aren't breathing. Within seconds, their brain activity, even at the brainstem level, starts to go flat. By every medical definition we had before CPR, that person is dead.
So neurone doesn't quite capture the gravity of it. They've crossed the line.
They've crossed the clinical threshold, exactly. So in 2022, a huge multidisciplinary group led by a researcher we'll talk about a lot, Dr. Sam Parnia, they published this big consensus statement, and they proposed the term we're using. We're called experience of death, RED-D.
Okay, so RED-D, what's the practical difference? How does that new term help us sort through the data?
It's all about separating the signal from the noise.
Yeah.
A genuine RAD has this very specific, repeatable story, this narrative arc. It involves transcendence, feeling like you're outside your body, and it's transformative. People come back changed.
And the noise, what are we trying to filter out?
The noise is stuff like delirium, hallucinations from a fever, or something we now call CPR-induced consciousness, CPR-IF.
CPR, what's that like?
It's usually awful. It's confusing, painful, fragmented. People might have a vague, terrifying awareness of the resuscitation itself, like feeling the chest compressions or hearing muffled voices. It's chaos. A RED-D is the opposite. It's lucid, structured, and coherent. And that coherent signal is what we're focusing on.
That distinction is so important. So we're zeroing in on a very specific, structured human experience. Okay, let's build our foundation then. Layer 01. What's the first thing that just leaps out of the data? For me, it's the consistency, this universal script.
That consistency is probably the single biggest piece of evidence against the idea that these are just random hallucinations. If your brain was truly just firing randomly as it died, you'd expect chaos. You'd get an infinite variety of bizarre, incoherent experiences.
You don't.
You don't. Instead, you get this remarkably stable structure, and you see it in people of all ages, all cultures, all religions, even in people who had never heard of an NDE before they had one.
And this was all really nailed down by that huge study in The Lancet back in 2001, the Van Lommel study. They're the ones who really mapped out this repeating story.
They did. And that story, that arc, it breaks down into about 5 key stages. It almost always starts with this sense of ineffability and separation.
The out-of-body experience, the OBE.
That's the one. The feeling of floating out of your body, looking down on the scene, on your own resuscitation from, a corner of the room. And the paradox is they report seeing everything with incredible clarity, even though their eyes are shut and there's no blood flowing to their retinas.
Functionally blind, but seeing with perfect clarity. It's mind-bending. What comes next?
After the separation comes the transition. This is the famous tunnel. Almost every account describes moving, often very quickly, through a dark space or a tunnel toward a brilliant, beautiful point of light in the distance.
The tunnel, which, as we'll get into, the materialist explanations have a very, very neat answer for.
A very elegant one, yes. But once they reach that light, they enter phase 3, the encounter. They emerge into this realm of just unearthly light. They'll say it's brighter than 1,000 suns, but it doesn't hurt their eyes. And there they meet beings. Deceased relatives, often looking young and healthy, sometimes spiritual figures that align with their beliefs, or, very commonly, just a being of light that radiates this feeling of absolute unconditional love and acceptance.
That's where it gets very spiritual. But the next phase, the life review, is, well, it's almost a cognitive or ethical event.
It is, the life review. And this is so much more than just watching a movie of your life. It's described as like a holographic 360-degree re-experiencing of your entire existence all at once. Not linear.
But the key part, the part that's so hard to explain as just a memory dump, is the empathy, right?
That's the absolute crucial feature. You don't just see what you did. You are forced to feel the consequences of your actions from the perspective of the other person. You feel the pain you caused them. You feel the joy you gave them. It's as if you become them for that moment.
A total empathy override. I mean, that feels way too organized for a brain that's just randomly firing off old memories.
It's a profound moral reckoning. And then finally, there's the return. The person reaches some kind of boundary, a wall, a river, a line they know they can't cross. And they feel this immense reluctance, sometimes even anger about having to go back. And then snap. They're back in their body, back in the pain.
But the big question is this just cultural programming? You know, I've seen movies, I've heard stories, so when my brain is dying, it just serves up the script I'm expecting. Confirmation bias at the end of life?
It's the most common critique, and it's a fair one, but the research really doesn't support it. While let's call it the interpretive layer, is cultural. A Christian might identify the being of light as Jesus, for example. The underlying structural layer is universal. The OBE, the tunnel, the encounter, the review, that's the same everywhere.
And it goes way back, right? This isn't a new phenomenon that started with modern medicine.
Not at all. We have records that fit this template perfectly from deep history. In the 8th century, the historian the Venerable Bede wrote about a monk named Drythelm who died and came back. He described a journey through a dark valley, the tunnel guided by a shining countenance into a realm of immense light. The script is right there.
And even before that, the ancient Greeks were thinking about this.
Absolutely. Plato's Republic, written around 380 BC, ends with the myth of Ur. Ur is a soldier left for dead who revives on his own funeral pyre. And he describes this incredible cosmic journey of judgment and seeing the structure of the universe. Again, it's that same arc of transcendent travel and ethical review.
It's not just a Western thing.
No. Researchers have found similar accounts in indigenous cultures from North America to Melanesia that were completely isolated from these Western traditions. They all have stories of a journey to an other world. It really strongly suggests that the RID is a fundamental human experience when we die.
So the universality is a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But if we're looking for the absolute strongest single piece of evidence, the one case that really challenges the easy explanations, we have to talk about Pam Reynolds.
Ah, yes. The Pam Reynolds case from 1991, this is the gold standard anomaly. It's as close as we've ever gotten to a controlled experiment of aridity.
Set the scene for us. What was happening medically that makes her case so unique?
Pam Reynolds had a giant aneurysm, a weak ballooning blood vessel at the base of her brainstem, a really dangerous spot. To operate on it, her surgeon, Dr. Robert Spetzler, had to use this radical procedure called deep hypothermic cardiac arrest.
Which is basically induced death.
It is. They lowered her body temperature down to a shocking 15.5 degrees Celsius, that's 60 Fahrenheit. They stopped her heart. They stopped her breathing. And this is key. They drained all the blood out of her head to make the aneurysm collapse so they could work on it.
So she's cold, she has no heartbeat, and no blood in her brain.
And her eyes were taped shut. But here's the detail that makes this case the bedrock of consciousness studies.
The BAPs.
The BAEPs, brainstem auditory evoked potentials. Throughout the procedure, they had little speakers in her ears blasting 100 decibel clicks. That's as loud as a jackhammer.
Why do that?
It's a test. Electrodes on her scalp were measuring if her brainstem was processing that sound at all. If it was, you'd see a little blip, a wave pattern. Her BAEPs were flatline. It was definitive proof that no sensory information, not even the most primitive reflex, was getting through. Her brain was completely, verifiably offline.
So dead by every clinical measure.
Yeah.
And that is when she had her experience.
That's when. She described being pulled out of the top of her head by a humming sound, a natural D tone, she called it. And from a position above the operating table, she watched them. And she reported 2 specific, verifiable details that she should not have been able to perceive.
The first one is the bone saw. It's such a strange, specific detail.
It is. She said that the tool they were using to open her skull looked like an electric toothbrush. Now, that is a bizarre, counterintuitive way to describe a bone saw. But it was a perfect, if quirky, description of the specific Midas Rex saw they used. It's a small, handheld device, not some big power tool.
It's the kind of detail you wouldn't just make up. It's too mundane. And what was the second thing?
The auditory detail. Even with the 100 decibel clicks in her ears, she reported hearing a female surgeon, Dr. Murray, say her veins and arteries are very small. And she heard them discussing a problem with the cannulation in her right groin, which is exactly where they were hooking her up to the heart-lung machine.
Okay, so she saw things with her eyes taped shut and heard things while her brainstem was functionally deaf. That sounds like a smoking gun for consciousness existing outside the brain.
It's the strongest single case, for sure. But science demands we look at the toughest skeptical analysis, and for this case, that comes from an anesthesiologist named Dr. Gerald Worley.
What's his counterargument?
He drills down on the timing. He argues that the conversation about her small veins that happened during the preparation for the surgery, before they induced the full hypothermic arrest.
Ah, so there was a potential window.
A potential window where she could have been experiencing something called anesthesia awareness. It's rare, but it happens. Your body is paralyzed, but your mind is still processing some sensory input, especially hearing.
Okay, that could maybe explain the hearing. What about the saw? She heard the saw too, but the BAPs were flat.
Worley's argument is bone conduction. The sound of the drill on her skull could have vibrated through the bone directly to her inner ear, bypassing the ear canal where the clicks were playing. So the BAPs, which test air conduction, wouldn't have picked it up.
So the hearing could have a physical explanation, maybe, but that still doesn't touch the visual part, seeing the shape of the saw from above.
And that's where the debate rests. The Reynolds case is a profound anomaly because of the BAEPs, but the ambiguity about the timing allows a materialist to argue for anesthesia awareness. Still, that explanation really struggles to account for the clear, structured, visual perspective. It's the case that forces us to move on, to dive into the physiological machinery itself, our layer 2.
Right, so if it's not a soul leaving the body, the materialist model says it has to be the brain's final chaotic fireworks show.
Ah.
We're now diving deep into that model, the idea that this whole transcendent experience is just the predictable mechanics of dying organ.
And the primary driver, the first domino to fall, is cerebral hypoxia. The second your heart stops, oxygen delivery to the brain stops. And since the brain is the most energy-hungry organ in the body, everything that happens next is a direct result of that oxygen starvation.
So let's start with the most famous part, the tunnel. How does hypoxia create that tunnel?
It's actually a beautifully simple explanation. It has to do with how the visual cortex is built. The neurons that process your peripheral vision are much more fragile, much more metabolically demanding than the ones that process your central vision.
So they're the first to go when the oxygen runs out.
They fail first. So what you experience is the edges of your vision literally going dark and collapsing inward, which creates the subjective feeling of rushing forward through a tunnel. The little bit of central vision you have left is the light at the end of the tunnel.
And that light itself.
Now, that might just be the chaotic final electrical discharge of the retina and the visual cortex, phosphenes they're called. A final burst of neural noise that you perceive as light.
Okay, that's a very compelling explanation for the tunnel. But what about something as complex as the life review? That holographic empathic experience seems way too structured for just random noise.
The explanation for that is a concept called cortical disinhibition. See, your brain, to function, is constantly using brakes. There are special inhibitory neurons whose whole job is to suppress information, to filter out the noise so you can focus.
And these brake neurons, they must use a lot of energy.
A huge amount. They are incredibly metabolically demanding, which means when hypoxia hits, those inhibitory neurons, the brakes fail before the excitatory neurons do.
The brakes come off the sense.
The brakes come off, and you get this runaway cascade of neural firing. The medial temporal lobe, where your memories are stored, essentially just dumps its entire contents at once. It's a simultaneous, holographic flash of everything you've ever experienced.
It's not a recall, it's a system dump. The brain isn't dying quietly, it's screaming out everything it's ever known.
Precisely. And the intense emotional feeling, the empathy part, could be because the memory centers in the temporal lobe are firing at the same time as the emotional centers in the limbic system, which are right next door and also highly susceptible.
Okay, so that's the electrical side. But what about the neurochemistry? This is where we get into things like the DMT hypothesis.
Right, the spirit molecule. The idea, proposed by Dr. Rick Strassman, is that the pineal gland might release a huge flood of N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, right at the moment of death. It's a naturally occurring psychedelic in the body.
And when you compare a DMT trip to a AD, how close is the match?
The overlap is pretty significant. A 2018 study did a head-to-head comparison. Both DMT users and people who'd had REDs reported leaving their bodies, entering other dimensions, meeting intelligent beings, and feeling the sense of cosmic unity.
So that sounds like it could be the chemical key.
It's a strong analog, but there are some really crucial differences. DMT experiences tend to be much more chaotic, full of complex geometric patterns, and often described as alien or technological. People talk about meeting machine elves.
Whereas RADs are much more personal and human.
Exactly. The RD narrative is about deceased relatives, a moral review of your life, a clear boundary. It's a human story, not a psychedelic geometric light show. So DMT is a parallel, but not a perfect explanation.
What other chemical models are there? I know ketamine comes up a lot.
Yes, the ketamine model is very useful for explaining the OBE part. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic. In high doses, it can induce what's called a K-hole, which feels a lot like floating, being detached from your body and moving through a dark void.
Which maps perfectly onto the OBE in the tunnel.
It does. And it suggests that OBE is caused by a breakdown of sensory integration at a specific spot in the brain called the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ.
The TPJ. What does that part of the brain do?
Its job is to fuse all your sensory data, vision, balance, body position to create a stable sense of where you are in space. If you disrupt the TPJ with a drug like ketamine or with hypoxia, the brain can't locate the self in the body anymore. The signals don't match up.
And the brain's solution is to generate the experience of floating outside looking down.
It's the most logical computation it can make from the conflicting data.
Okay, so we have a model for the tunnel, the life review, and the OBE. What about that overwhelming feeling of cosmic importance, the ineffability, the divine feeling?
For that, we have to look at temporal lobe transients, sometimes called the God spot. The temporal lobes, especially on the right side, are deeply involved with emotion, memory, and mystical experience.
This goes all the way back to the neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, right?
It does. Back in the 40s and 50s, he found he could trigger vivid memories, hallucinations, and even the feeling of a presence in the room just by electrically stimulating a patient's temporal lobe.
And people with temporal lobe epilepsy sometimes report intense spiritual experiences during a seizure.
They do. So the materialist conclusion is that the profound, transcendent feeling of the RA isn't a glimpse of the divine. It's the subjective feeling of a massive electrical surge, a kind of terminal seizure in the temporal lobes as the brain's final energy collapses. It's the brain generating its own most meaningful experience as it shuts down.
So there it is. A very complete, very cohesive materialist theory. But this is where we hit layer 3, the cutting edge of the research. And this is where that neat, tidy model starts to come apart because of data that suggests the brain is doing the exact opposite of just chaotically failing.
Right. The entire materialist model is built on the assumption that the dying brain gets quieter and more chaotic until it goes silent. But recent hard data shows something else entirely. It shows a highly organized and hyperactive brain. This is the paradox of lucidity.
And the first clue came from animal studies, of all things.
Yes, a 2013 study from Jimo Borjigin's lab at the University of Michigan that just floored the neuroscience community. They had rats on EEG monitors during induced cardiac arrest, and they saw something they never expected.
A huge surge of brain activity.
A massive global surge of high-frequency brainwaves called gamma oscillations. And the critical part is that this happened after the heart had stopped. It was a post-mortem event.
And gamma waves are important. They aren't just random noise. They're linked to higher consciousness.
Yeah. They're the signature of active conscious processing. They're what your brain uses to bind different perceptions together into a single, coherent experience. But the most stunning part wasn't just that there was gamma. It was that the gamma was highly organized. It was phase-coupled with theta waves.
What does that mean, phase-coupled?
Think of it like a symphony orchestra. Theta waves are the slow, steady rhythm of the drum section, often linked to memory retrieval. Gamma waves are the fast, complex melody of the violins. When they're coupled, it means the violins are playing in perfect time with the drums. It's not noise. It's a complex, integrated piece of music.
It's a sign of a highly organized, functional brain.
And here's the kicker. The level of that organized, conscious activity, those markers of consciousness, were higher in the 30 seconds after the rat's heart stopped and when they were fully awake and walking around.
They were having a moment of hyperconsciousness as they died.
A peak state of activity, not a slow fade to black. But of course, the immediate question was, okay, that's rats. Does this happen in humans?
And a decade later, in 2023, we got the answer.
The follow-up study, published in PNAS, with many of the same researchers, looked at EEG data from 4 dying patients in an ICU after their life support was withdrawn.
A real-world window into the dying process. What did they see?
In 2 of the 4 patients, as their oxygen levels crashed, they saw the exact same thing they saw in the rats. A huge, powerful surge of organized gamma activity.
And was it all over the brain or at a specific spot?
It was highly localized, which is another sign that it's not just a seizure. The activity was concentrated in the temporoparieto-occipital junction, the TPO.
Let's break that down. Why is the TPO junction so important?
It's what neuroscientists call the posterior hot zone. It's the brain's main hub for conscious experience. It's where your brain takes vision, your sense of self in space, and your memories, and knits them all together into the single, unified reality you experience right now.
So the very seat of consciousness was lighting up like a Christmas tree at the moment of death.
It provides the hard, biological evidence that the dying human brain is capable of generating the kind of organized, complex activity needed for a lucid, vivid experience. It confirms the lucid interval is real.
But proving the brain can have an experience is one thing. Verifying the content of that experience, especially the out-of-body part, is the next step. And that leads us straight to the AWARE-2 study.
The Awareness During Resuscitation study, this was the big one, led by Dr. Parnia, the largest study of its kind ever attempted, designed to finally get that smoking gun proof for the OBE.
And they used the famous spirit trap idea.
That was the core of it. In the resuscitation rooms, they placed tablets and screens up on high shelves facing the ceiling. And these screens displayed random images or codes.
The idea being that if your consciousness really does float up out of your body, you should be able to look down, see the image, and report it later.
Exactly. It was the ultimate test. If anyone got it right, it would change everything.
And the results, published in 2023, were complicated.
They were profoundly mixed. On the big question, the visual targets, the result was a clear 0. Not a single one of the 567 patients saw the hidden images.
Wow, that's a huge blow to the idea that the OBE is a literal physical event.
It is. It suggests the OBE is more of a subjective internal experience, not your spirit eyes literally floating around the room. But, and this is a huge but, the study also found powerful evidence for the persistence of consciousness.
How so?
Of the survivors they could interview, nearly 40% had some kind of memory or perception of being conscious during their cardiac arrest. And even more amazing, the EEG data they collected during CPR showed that nearly 40% of patients had bursts of normal or near-normal brain activity.
How long?
This is the mind-blowing part. These spikes of gamma, delta, and theta waves markers of thought were showing up as late as 60 minutes into CPR.
An hour after their heart stopped. When the brain should be long gone, it was still showing signs of organized activity.
So that's the paradox of Layer 3. AWARE-2 failed to verify the external, literal OBE, but it powerfully confirmed the internal capacity for consciousness is way more resilient than we ever thought.
The lucid interval is real. The floating consciousness, not so much. And that tension, that paradox, pushes us right into our final layer, Layer 4, the essence of the problem. Because even without the spirit trap data, there are still these anomalies, these stories that just don't fit the materialist model.
Exactly. These are the veridical reports, the cases where people perceived things that were later verified, things they had no business knowing. These are the cases that keep the debate raging.
And probably the most famous, the one that's hardest to just wave away, is the case of Maria's shoe.
From 1977, Maria was a migrant worker who had a cardiac arrest in a Seattle hospital. When she was revived, she told her social worker, a woman named Kimberly Clark, that she had floated outside the hospital building.
And what did she see?
She said she saw a single tennis shoe on the window ledge of the 3rd floor. And she gave these incredibly specific, mundane details. She said it was a dark blue men's shoe, that it had a noticeable stuff mark over the little toe, and that one of the laces was tucked under the heel.
The detail is everything. It's not just a shoe.
Right. So Kimberly Clark, probably not expecting to find anything, went looking. She had to go to a different room on that floor, open a window, and lean out precariously to see the lid. And there it was, the shoe, exactly as Marie had described it. Dark blue, scuff mark, lace tucked under the heel.
I mean, how do you explain that? Her brain is oxygen deprived, her body is in a room somewhere else, and she's acquiring new, specific, verifiable visual information from an impossible location.
It's the kind of data that the materialist model just hits a brick wall with. Skeptics say maybe the account was embellished over the years, but the specificity makes it incredibly hard to dismiss.
And it's not the only one. There was the dentures case from that big Van Lommel study.
Right. A man who was deep in a coma during his resuscitation. When he woke up, he was able to point out the exact nurse who had taken out his dentures during the chaos, and he described precisely where she put them, in a little sliding drawer on the crash cart.
Something he absolutely could not have seen while he was unconscious and they were pounding on his chest.
It's this recurring theme of observational capacity persisting, even being enhanced, while the brain is shutting down. And that connects to another, equally baffling phenomenon, terminal lucidity.
This one is just. It directly challenges what we think we know about diseases like Alzheimer's.
It does. We're talking about patients in the final stages of a neurodegenerative disease. Their brains, the physical hardware, are ravaged. The circuits for memory and personality are physically destroyed. They've been unresponsive, maybe nonverbal, for years.
And then, just before they die.
In the hours or sometimes just minutes before death, they have this sudden, shocking return to clarity. They wake up, they recognize their family, they have lucid, meaningful conversations, they are themselves again for one last time, and then they pass away.
If the brain produces the mind, how is that possible? If the hardware is destroyed, how can the software suddenly run perfectly?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. It's a profound challenge to the production theory of consciousness. If the circuits needed to retrieve those memories are physically gone, how is the retrieval happening?
It forces you to ask, if the brain isn't producing consciousness, what else could be going on?
It forces you to seriously consider the alternative. The transmission theory. And this isn't some new age idea. It was proposed by the great psychologist and philosopher William James way back in 1898.
What's his analogy for it?
He said the brain isn't a factory that generates consciousness. He said it's more like a prism or a lens or a transceiver. In this model, consciousness is fundamental, like gravity. It's a universal field that's all around us.
And the brain's job is to filter it.
Exactly. The brain is a reducing valve. It tunes out the infinite cosmic consciousness so you can focus on the important stuff for survival, like finding food and not getting eaten by a tiger. It filters it down to a manageable trickle.
But when you're dying,
or in deep meditation, or using psychedelics, that filter breaks down. The reducing valve opens up, and the white radiance of universal consciousness floods in. That, subjectively, is the RAD.
And that model would neatly explain the gamma surge we saw in layer 3.
It would. In the transmission model, that gamma surge isn't the brain creating the experience. It's the signal of the transceiver opening up to maximum bandwidth. It's the brain tuning into the cosmic signal as clearly as it possibly can in its final moments.
And if we want to get really into the weeds of a potential physical mechanism for this, we have to at least mention ORCAR, the quantum consciousness theory.
This is the theory from physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. It's a huge leap, but they argue that consciousness isn't generated by neurons firing. It's generated by quantum computations happening in tiny structures inside the neurons called microtubules.
So consciousness is a quantum process. How does that explain a RAD?
Well, quantum information is non-local. It isn't tied to one specific place. They propose that when the body dies, the quantum coherence in the microtubules is lost. But the information itself, the stuff that makes up your consciousness, isn't destroyed. It just leaks out. It decoheres into the fundamental geometry of space-time itself.
So the information that is you is released back into the fabric of the universe.
Exactly. And if you're resuscitated, that quantum information can re-enter the microtubules. If not, it persists out there, non-locally. It's a very controversial theory, but it's one of the only ones that even attempts to provide a physical bridge for things like Maria's shoe or terminal lucidity.
It's a framework that tries to give a home to the data that otherwise just doesn't fit. instead of just dismissing it.
And that really is the main takeaway. The last 7 minutes are not a simple ending. It's an active, profound, and incredibly complex frontier that science is only just beginning to explore.
Okay, let's try and pull all these layers together for everyone listening. What are the big takeaways from this deep dive?
I think the first is that the RAD is a real structured event. It's not just a dream or a hallucination. It has a conserved, universal structure that makes it an authentic and distinct state of consciousness that we need to take seriously.
Second, the brain isn't just fading to black. It's paradoxically hyperactive.
Right. The new EEG data proves the dying brain can generate highly organized, complex gamma waves in the very seat of consciousness. So the capacity for a lucid experience is there.
Okay, third is that critical split between the how and the what.
Exactly. The materialist models are great at explaining how the brain might generate a tunnel or a life review, but they completely fail to explain the verified what the specific real-world perceptions in cases like Maria's shoe.
And fourth, terminal lucidity.
It's a massive challenge to the production theory. The fact that a physically destroyed brain can suddenly function perfectly suggests the mind and brain might be more separate than we think, which aligns better with the transmission model.
And finally, the big AWARE-2 study gave us that mixed result. No smoking gun for the literal OBE, but massive confirmation of the internal lucid interval.
It failed to verify the floating eyes, but it proved consciousness is incredibly resilient, with biomarkers showing up an hour into CPR.
So what the science seems to be telling us is that as the brain's normal rules break down, the mind, whether it's being generated by the brain or transmitted through it, experiences this unbelievably intense synthesis of life and meaning. The end isn't darkness, it's an explosion of light.
It is. And maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. Across all the research, the most consistent finding is how profoundly a RAD changes a person. They lose their fear of death. They reevaluate their entire lives, focusing on love and empathy over material things. Now, regardless of whether the cause is purely physical or something more, if an experience can so permanently and positively alter a person's entire moral and psychological being, what does that tell us about the ultimate function of consciousness itself?